For just a few short days, the world held its breath. Talks were ongoing. A fragile ceasefire had been struck. After weeks of devastating strikes under Operation Epic Fury, it actually seemed, for a brief, almost surreal moment, like peace might be within reach. Diplomats were in the room. Both sides were at the table. And then, in the blink of an eye, it all collapsed. Because on April 12th, 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump did something that no one in the international community had dared to predict. He turned the entire war on its head. He announced that the United States Navy would impose a naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, flipping the script on Iran and taking away the one card that Tehran had been playing for weeks. This is the story of how we got here, what the blockade actually looks like, what it means for the world, and whether the United States can actually pull it off. This is one of the most consequential military and economic moves of the 21st century. And we are breaking it all down for you right now on World Brief Daily. Before we go any further, if you haven't subscribed to World Brief Daily yet, now is exactly the right moment. Hit that subscribe button and enable notifications so you never miss a critical update as this crisis continues to unfold in real time. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this blockade, but the beginning of the war that made it inevitable. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a surprise air war against Iran. The strikes targeted military installations, government infrastructure, and, in a move that shocked even seasoned intelligence analysts, killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and a number of other senior Iranian officials. The 2026 Iran war had begun, and Iran responded immediately. Within days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, announced that the Strait of Hormuz was closed, not just to American vessels, to everyone. As confirmed by Wikipedia's comprehensive timeline of the crisis, the IRGC issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait, launched at least 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships, and is widely believed to have laid sea mines across the waterway. Major shipping firms suspended operations immediately. The world's most critical energy choke point, a narrow strip of water through which roughly 20 to 25% of the world's seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas passes every single day, had been slammed shut. The economic consequences were immediate and brutal. According to data released by the Joint Maritime Information Center in Bahrain, daily shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped by more than 90% almost overnight. Brent crude prices surged by around 40% from the start of the war. Oil was flirting with, and at times, crossing the $100 per barrel threshold. Fertilizer prices climbed. Agricultural input costs spiked worldwide. And in the Persian Gulf, an extraordinary and deeply troubling statistic emerged. According to the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis Wikipedia entry, approximately 230 loaded oil tankers were waiting inside the Gulf, unable to move, their cargo trapped behind Iran's blockade. A floating traffic jam of energy. An economic siege felt from Tokyo to London. And here is the truly extraordinary part of Iran's strategy. While it was shutting the world out, it was letting its own exports through. As reported by Bloomberg, between March 1st and March 23rd alone, Iran was exporting an average of 1.6 million barrels of oil per day, earning the regime approximately $139 million every single day from an oil market that Iran itself had sent into a frenzy. That is over $4 billion per month flowing into a regime that was simultaneously charging tolls, reportedly upward of $1 to $2 million per ship, for any vessel that wanted to attempt transit. As Trump would later put it on Truth Social, calling it world extortion, the regime had weaponized global energy markets in a way that made it, temporarily at least, a financial beneficiary of its own act of war. That is the context. That is the scale of the leverage Iran was holding. And that is exactly what makes the decision Trump announced on April 12th so seismic. But how did we even get to the point of peace talks collapsing? Because for a brief window, it looked like diplomacy might prevail. On April 8th, the United States and Iran agreed to a temporary 2-week ceasefire. The announcement sent a wave of cautious relief through global markets. Pakistan had stepped in as a mediator, and its last-minute intervention seemed to have pulled both sides back from the brink, particularly after the U.S. had been reportedly planning to escalate strikes on Iranian power infrastructure and bridges. Iran, for its part, announced it would reopen the Strait of Hormuz for the duration of the ceasefire. There was a 10-point framework being assembled. There were negotiators in the same room. For a few days, the world dared to hope, but hope in this conflict has a very short shelf life. The ceasefire began to fray almost immediately. Just hours after the announcement, Israel launched a massive aerial assault on Lebanon that, according to BBC reporting, killed 303 people and wounded another 1,150. Israel's stated position was that Lebanon was not party to the ceasefire. Iran saw it differently. Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. An attack on Hezbollah was, in Tehran's eyes, an attack on Iran's strategic infrastructure. The ceasefire, from Iran's perspective, may have been violated before the ink was dry. Then came the Islamabad talks, a marathon negotiating session on April 11th and 12th, with the U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance sitting across from Iranian and Pakistani negotiators for more than 21 hours, as reported by CNBC. The sessions were intensive. Progress was apparently made on multiple fronts. But there was one issue, one single, immovable sticking point that neither side could get past: Iran's nuclear program. Trump laid it out starkly in an April 12th Truth Social post. "So, there you have it," he wrote. "The meeting went well, most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not." And then came the bombshell. Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. According to reporting by Time magazine, Iran's position was not simply about nuclear pride. Tehran believed its grip on the Strait of Hormuz gave it the leverage to demand more from Washington, perhaps a more generous sanctions relief package, perhaps war reparations, which Iranian state media confirmed Tehran had demanded, along with a broader regional ceasefire covering Lebanon. Iran also sought the release of its frozen assets abroad. Vance would later tell Fox News that the U.S. had put forward its best final offer in Islamabad, but that the offer, which included ending Iran's uranium enrichment program, was something Tehran's regime was incapable of accepting without what it saw as a humiliating public capitulation. And in revolutionary Iran, where ideological face-saving is existential, humiliation is simply not an option. There was also a follow-up post from Trump that added more fuel to the fire. Iran promised to open the Strait of Hormuz, and they knowingly failed to do so, he wrote. This caused anxiety, dislocation, and pain to many people and countries throughout the world. The ceasefire had in practice become a fiction, as Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber confirmed on April 9th. The strait was still not open despite the announced ceasefire, with Iran still restricting and conditioning traffic and 230 loaded tankers waiting inside the Gulf. So Trump decided to pick up Iran's own weapon and turn it around. No more demands, no more ultimatums, a blockade for a blockade. Now here is where it gets deeply interesting and deeply complex, because the U.S. blockade is not a simple, clean affair. There are layers to it. And understanding those layers is the key to understanding whether this gamble is a masterstroke or a catastrophe in slow motion. On April 13th, at exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. naval blockade officially took effect. According to U.S. Central Command, the blockade would apply specifically to ships entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And critically, CENTCOM confirmed that it would not impede the freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. That distinction matters enormously. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, breathe something resembling relief. They are not the target. Their tankers are not, at least in American eyes, the problem. But the word relief needs to be used very carefully here. In the first 24 hours of the blockade, CENTCOM reported that over 10,000 U.S. personnel, supported by more than a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, were enforcing the operation. No vessels attempted to breach the blockade. 6 commercial ships that received orders were redirected back to Iranian ports, according to Wikipedia's entry on the naval blockade. Ship tracking data, as reported by CNN, showed that little traffic was entering or leaving Iranian ports on that first full day of operations. By early Monday morning, hours before the blockade officially took effect, shipping analytics firm Kepler's real-time data showed vessels proactively avoiding the strait entirely, with far fewer ships in the area than the day before. What is the hardware behind this operation? Let's talk about that, because the U.S. military presence in this region is formidable. According to CBS News, the U.S. military currently has the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, 11 destroyers, and the USS Tripoli amphibious group operating in the Middle East. The USS Gerald Ford and additional destroyers are deployed in the Mediterranean and are within range of the theater. Before the blockade began, U.S. Central Command dispatched 2 guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy, through the Strait of Hormuz on a mine-clearing mission. Both are Arleigh Burke-class destroyers loaded with the advanced Aegis combat system designed to detect and counter incoming drones and missiles. The USS Santa Barbara and the USS Canberra may also be deployed, as both carry MH-60S helicopters equipped with the AN/AES-1 airborne laser mine detection system, purpose-built to find surface-level mines. Some of those same helicopters may be carrying AN/ASQ-235 airborne mine neutralization systems, essentially expendable kamikaze drones that are deployed directly into any mine they detect, destroying it on impact. Why does mine clearing matter so much? Because it may be the single most critical phase of the entire blockade. Iran is believed to hold between 2,000 and 6,000 naval mines, according to the Jerusalem Post. And there is a complicating factor that borders on the absurd. U.S. officials have stated that Iran has, in their words, forgotten where some of its mines were placed. If Iran's own forces don't know where all the mines are, clearing a safe passage corridor through the strait becomes an enormous and potentially dangerous operation. America's apparent priority is to establish clear pathways to Iran's major ports, routes that would allow the U.S. to enforce its interdiction regime while allowing non-Iranian commercial traffic through. Retired Admiral James Stavridis, who previously served as NATO's supreme allied commander, offered a useful framework for thinking about the blockade in a conversation with Fortune. He described it as sitting halfway between leaving the strait under Iranian control and the earlier threat to wipe out Iran as a civilization. It puts economic pressure on Tehran without destroying the oil facilities, which you should want to preserve into the future, he told Fortune. It is worth noting that those oil facilities, if preserved, would be enormously valuable in any post-war reconstruction and normalization scenario. But the blockade itself is, as Andreas Krieg, senior lecturer at King's College London School of Security Studies, told NBC News, not a clean historical blockade. It is, in his words, a messy, high-risk interdiction regime. The U.S. would need to identify, track, hail, divert, and in some cases potentially board vessels linked to Iranian ports, all while operating in one of the most crowded, politically sensitive, and now heavily mined waterways on Earth. This is a good moment to pause, and this is also a good time to remind you that this is World Brief Daily. If you want the most comprehensive, in-depth analysis of the most important military and geopolitical stories unfolding across the world, this is the channel for you. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications, because this story is not slowing down. Not this week, not this month. Now back to the stakes. And the stakes here are as global as it gets. Iran's strategy in response to the U.S. blockade has been so far a combination of defiance, threats, and, intriguingly, a hint of ongoing openness. Iran's armed forces declared the blockade amounted to piracy. The IRGC warned that any military vessels approaching Hormuz would be considered in violation of the ceasefire deal. Iranian parliamentary spokesman Ibrahim Rizayeh wrote on X that the blockade was a bluff, and that Iran may also reveal other cards that we have not yet used in this game. Iran's acting defense minister announced that the country's armed forces were on, and this is a phrase that should focus every mind, maximum combat alert. But Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi simultaneously made diplomatic calls to his Saudi and Qatari counterparts. And according to CNN reporting, on April 14th, at least 4 ships related to Iran crossed the Strait of Hormuz, suggesting the blockade, and as Trump himself would later hint, was still evolving into its enforcement phase. Meanwhile, the international reaction has been equally significant. Russian Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov warned on the record, telling reporters, most likely such actions will continue to negatively impact international markets. He added that many details remained unclear and that Moscow would refrain from more substantive comments for now. China, which buys the vast majority of Iran's oil exports, faces enormous economic exposure. India, another major buyer of Gulf energy, is similarly vulnerable. As Robin Brooks, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, wrote in a Substack post, China would actually have an incentive to pressure Tehran to reopen the strait because a continued blockade of Iran's oil exports deprives Beijing of a critical energy supply while strangling the Iranian regime of the hard currency it needs to sustain its war machine. The United Kingdom announced it would not join the American blockade, a significant diplomatic signal from Washington's closest traditional ally. But just hours after Trump suggested other nations were willing to participate, a senior NATO military official told CBS News that the UK was actually leading planning efforts of a coalition of more than 40 nations from around the world, many from NATO, aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. French President Emmanuel Macron echoed this framing, announcing that France and the United Kingdom would convene separate diplomatic talks aimed at restoring freedom of navigation. Netanyahu expressed full Israeli support for the naval blockade. The picture is one of complex, fractured international alignment, with America driving the hard enforcement action while European allies prefer multilateral diplomacy running in parallel. And then there is the question of what the U.S. is actually trying to achieve, because this is not simply a military exercise. This is economic warfare with extraordinary precision. Consider the numbers. According to Bloomberg, Iran was earning approximately $139 million per day from its oil exports during the first 3 weeks of March alone, over $4 billion per month. That is a staggering lifeline for a regime whose economy was already in deep distress before Operation Epic Fury began. Every tanker that cannot leave an Iranian port is money that does not reach Tehran. Every shipping company that stops paying Iran's illegal transit tolls, reportedly over $2 million per vessel, is another revenue stream that dries up. The U.S. does not need to destroy Iran to defeat it economically. It needs to close the tap. And that is precisely what the blockade is designed to do. Trump made his calculation explicit in a Fox News interview. They haven't left the bargaining table, he said. I predict they come back and they give us everything we want. And I tell my people, I want everything. I don't want 90%. I don't want 95%. I told them I want everything. This is not the language of compromise. This is the language of maximum pressure, a strategic doctrine the Trump administration has used before. The logic runs as follows. Make the cost of non-compliance so unbearable that the Iranian regime's survival instinct overrides its ideological rigidity. Vance put it bluntly on Fox News. If the Iranians are going to try to engage in economic terrorism, we're going to abide by the simple principle that no Iranian ships are getting out either. But here is where the gamble becomes visible. Iran's regime is not an ordinary government facing ordinary economic pressure. It is an ideological theocracy that has survived decades of sanctions, internal crises, proxy wars, and international isolation. Standard economic logic, the idea that when you hurt an economy badly enough, its government will make rational concessions, does not always apply cleanly to a regime whose legitimacy is based not on prosperity, but on revolutionary identity. Getting Iran to surrender its nuclear program in particular is, as former negotiations have shown repeatedly, extraordinarily difficult. The nuclear program is not just a strategic asset for Tehran. It is a matter of national pride, regime survival, and defiance of what Iran describes as Western imperialism. That is why J.D. Vance's best final offer was rejected. Not because Iran miscalculated, but because Iran's regime may genuinely believe it cannot survive the domestic political fallout of capitulating. There is also the operational challenge of keeping the blockade watertight. As NBC News analysis pointed out, enforcing an interdiction regime in the Strait of Hormuz is a complex, high-risk, legally contentious operation. In the short term, Fortune reported, analysts believe the U.S. can realistically escort 3 to 4 commercial ships per day through the strait, using 7 to 8 destroyers providing air cover, depending on the level of threat from Iranian midget submarines, fast boats, and drones. India and Pakistan have deployed their own destroyers to escort tankers in the Gulf of Oman, though not inside the Strait of Hormuz itself, with India executing what it calls Operation Urja Suraksha, deploying over 5 frontline warships, including destroyers and frigates, to escort more than 20 Indian-flagged cargo ships. But before the war, an average of 138 ships per day was transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The gap between what the U.S. can escort and what normal traffic demands is enormous. Anything that slips through that gap is a vulnerability. One successful Iranian strike on a commercial vessel, just one, could be enough to freeze all non-Iranian commercial shipping in the region again. The U.S. Navy's warships are hardened against Iranian drone and missile threats. Commercial tankers manned by civilian crews with no air defense systems are not. Iran has already demonstrated its capacity to make U.S. warships uncomfortable. When American destroyers crossed the Strait of Hormuz on April 11th, the IRGC immediately launched a drone in their direction, claiming in Iranian media that the U.S. vessels turned back as a result. However true that specific claim may be, it illustrates something important. Every American warship stationed in or near the strait to enforce the blockade is a slow-moving target inside what Fortune accurately described as a potential kill box. Iran has the mines, Iran has the fast boats, Iran has the drones, and Iran has the coastal geography. The U.S. has the firepower and the technology. The strait is narrow enough that both things are true simultaneously. So where does this go? What are the possible scenarios from here? The first is the scenario Trump is banking on. Economic pain forces Iran back to the table, and this time Tehran makes the concession on its nuclear program that it refused to make in Islamabad. The blockade in this scenario is a short-term instrument of maximum pressure that achieves a durable diplomatic solution. The Brookings Institution's Robin Brooks argued this was actually plausible, writing that China, deeply invested in Iranian oil, would be incentivized to lobby Tehran to reopen the strait, adding a powerful second-order economic pressure on the regime from Beijing. In this scenario, oil prices, which U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told the Semaphore World Economy Conference on April 13th, would remain high and maybe even rising until meaningful ship traffic gets through, would peak and then stabilize as a deal materializes, possibly within weeks. The second scenario is prolonged standoff. Iran does not fold quickly. The blockade holds but does not achieve the nuclear concession. The economic pain spreads beyond Iran into China, India, Europe, and yes, the United States itself. Global oil prices remain elevated or continue to rise. Brent crude, which surged past $103 per barrel immediately after Trump's blockade announcement, according to CNBC, could push significantly higher. The cost to the global economy of maintaining a long-term blockade escalates far beyond what any American administration could sustain politically. The third scenario, and the most dangerous, is escalation. Iran, feeling cornered and humiliated, decides to use those other cards that Reza hinted at. Fast boat swarm attacks, drone strikes on U.S. warships, a missile barrage on a non-Iranian commercial vessel, broader missile attacks on Gulf state infrastructure. Any one of these events could trigger a military response chain that is genuinely difficult to control. The Wall Street Journal, citing U.S. officials, reported that Trump was already considering the resumption of limited military strikes on Iran to break the negotiating deadlock, targeting what Trump himself described in a Fox News interview as Iran's desalination plants and electricity-generating infrastructure. The threat to destroy the little that is left of Iran was not rhetorical flourish. It is a contingency that is apparently being actively planned. And yet, and this is critical, the talks have not fully died. Vice President J.D. Vance told Fox News on April 14th that he believes Iran wanted to make a deal in Islamabad, despite decades of U.S.-Iran mistrust. The ball is in their court, he said. CNN reported that Trump himself was hinting that U.S.-Iran talks could potentially resume within the next 2 days. The blockade, it seems, is designed not as a permanent state of war, but as a pressure mechanism, a way of concentrating Iranian minds on the cost of walking away from a nuclear agreement. There is one final dimension to this story that deserves attention: Ukraine. Ukraine's direct military involvement in the Strait of Hormuz is essentially zero. The country barely has a navy, and what naval assets it does have are entirely committed to its ongoing war with Russia. But Ukraine has something arguably more valuable in the context of this conflict: unmatched real-world expertise in drone warfare. According to reporting on the situation, Ukraine is already sharing that expertise with Gulf nations, teaching them how to detect, intercept, and neutralize the exact kind of drone swarm tactics that Iran has been deploying in the Strait of Hormuz. In a conflict where Iranian drones have already demonstrated the ability to threaten U.S. destroyers, having partners in the Gulf who understand drone countermeasures at a granular battlefield-tested level could prove to be an unexpected but decisive advantage for the United States and its allies. So here is where we stand as of today. The blockade is live. The U.S. military has over 10,000 personnel and more than a dozen warships enforcing it. Ship traffic to and from Iranian ports has dropped dramatically. 6 vessels have already been turned back. No shots have yet been fired in direct enforcement of the blockade, though Iran's armed forces are at maximum combat alert. Oil is approaching $100 per barrel. China and India are watching with deep anxiety. Europe is convening emergency diplomacy. And somewhere in Tehran, the regime is doing its own calculations, weighing the cost of continued defiance against the humiliation of giving up the program that defines its revolutionary identity. This is, to use no other word, an extraordinary moment. The United States has flipped the script. It has taken Iran's most powerful piece of leverage and turned it into a weapon against the regime. Whether that move ends the war or escalates it is the question that will define the coming weeks. And this is World Brief Daily. We will be tracking every development, every ship movement, every diplomatic signal, and every military escalation in this crisis as it unfolds. Because this story, the story of the Strait of Hormuz, of Iran's nuclear ambitions, of the economic war that is currently being waged on the world's most vital waterway, is not over, not even close. If this breakdown gave you value, subscribe to World Brief Daily right now. Hit the bell. Every update on this crisis comes straight to you. We will keep you informed, we will keep you ahead of the news, and we will keep breaking down the stories that matter most. Thank you for watching.